in about 2 minutes, so if that makes sense.
Time to come in. I can see the numbers are growing.
Fantastic.
People are actually logging in. It's exciting.
I think I'm not sure what the end total was, but it was pretty good, very good for one of our lectures. So.
Yeah. All right,
Whenever y'all were holding in-person lectures, how big usually were the?
It varied because a lot of it had to do with what was going on at the Memorial Art Gallery that night. I mean, if we had 50 people, we were ecstatic. We had a few that were bigger, but usually I think it was probably kind of in the 35 to 50 range.
Okay.
Yes, and my dog, of course. You have to count my dog.
Yeah.
All right, I will put my phone on mute and turn off my video, and thank you guys so much.
Oh, thanks, Leslie.
I also believe that my mom and mom's dog are currently watching as well. So only I had a dog. I just had plants, alas. But yeah. So no, yeah, this is probably around double what we normally have. So.
Oh, really? I actually have no idea how many I don't know if you've mentioned anything, and I'm just gonna pretend I don't know.
Yeah, no. It's like standard class. I forget how many I have. Oh wow, I just saw it there. Okay, cool. Great. Yeah, I'm very excited. So before we'll get started in just a minute, but I also work in Sardinia and Menorca. So there's a lot of cool underwater stuff that I know nothing about from those regions, but I've always been super intrigued by it. So I'm very excited for.
Yeah, I know they've been doing a lot of more work off of, did you say Majorca?
Menorca, but
Menorca. Oh, okay. Yeah, I know they run a lot of field schools in any case off of there.
Oof,
good.
Yeah, so many.
Good diving, good archaeology, good way to get people in.
Yeah. Sunny Sarah, I forgot about that.
Don't know whenever I'll be diving in the Mediterranean again.
Yeah. Fingers crossed.
Another victim of the pandemic.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay. So my watch says, my watch is often wrong, but it says it's about 7:30. Does that seem about right? Yes. Well, we'll go with that. So I'll get started here. Welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see all the participants here today. It's very, very exciting. Welcome to the AIA Rochester's, one of two spring lectures for 2021. We're very excited to have Dr. Staci Willis with us, and I will introduce her in just a moment. Before I do that, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex Smith. I'm the president of the Rochester Society. I send you all the annoying emails, and you will get another email tomorrow about our April 1st meeting, where we will have a lecture by K.N. Pyburn, her talk, Grassroots Resource Preservation and Management in Kyrgyzstan, Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Heritage on a Human Scale. So that should be really exciting. But for society members, that will be our annual society business meeting on April Fool's Day, of all days, great day. And so for more information on that, I will be sending you more emails in the coming days with more information. Before we get started, a thank you to Harder Secrets and Emory LLP for hosting the event here today and providing the Zoom platform for us. And in particular, Stephanie Solfaro with her help in setting this all up. This would be impossible without you. You are an amazing person. This is part of the National Lecture Program. And for those of you who are not AIA members or AIA sort of veterans, if you will, we are a pretty big organization. We're around 200,000 members worldwide. We support archaeologists, educators, excavations, publications, research, and site preservation around the world. And we have a lot of cool resources that are available freely to in most cases at archaeological.org or archaeology.org for the magazine. So it's a cool organization to be a part of. And the Rochester Society is actually one of the oldest societies of the AIA, which is kind of awesome. And if you are interested in, you're seen Archaeology magazine before and you're interested in it, there's a readership of about 700,000 people per issue. That's amazing. And there's also the American Journal of Archaeology. These come with any membership if you do sign up for an AIA membership. What you're doing with that membership is you're supporting obviously archaeologists, but archaeology more generally, as well as these great publications. Also, it's really fun to get like, you know, stories about mummies and stuff. That's pretty cool. I particularly like, I don't know, but there's also lots of experiences with archaeology, obviously attending lectures, archaeological fairs, local events. We organize a lot with the AIA Rochester Society. We do have a couple local archaeology days that we hold normally in the summer and the fall, where you can come do some historical archaeology. So, you know, if you're interested in that, you can email us at archaeologyrochester@gmail.com, and we can give you more information on those. The AIA also provides a lot of links for these things on their website, and you can sort of dig in to more opportunities. No, bad joke, but had to do it. And of course, you know, you can become a part of the adventure, uncover the past, experience the thrill of discovery, I like that, and enjoy exclusive member benefits. And there are a lot of them. So if you've ever thought about joining the AIA, it's actually rather inexpensive, and we rely on the generosity of donors and support to support our mission and people who are members. So it's a cool present. It's a cool thing to have on your own. And if you're already a member, you know, we love donations as well, I guess. And we are somewhat required to give this talk before, or rather to give this spiel before the talk, but it is true. It is a cool organization to be a part of. So that's about it for me. If we want to change, I'll stop sharing right here. And while we're switching screens, I will give you a couple technical details, and then I'll introduce Dr. Willis. So this is a webinar format, so we can't see you or hear you necessarily while the lecture is, this lecture is being recorded too. That's a good thing to bring up. So if you'd like to ask a question though, you can do so during the lecture in the Q&A sort of option on the bottom of the screen. All questions will be answered though at the end of the presentation. So Dr. Willis will not be answering your questions during it. But feel free to use the Q&A during the lecture itself. That's absolutely okay. Finally, to introduce Dr. Willis. Dr. Staci Willis is professor of anthropology at Houston Community College and holds her degrees from Texas A&M University, PhD, and the University of Chicago, your MA, I believe, and the Baylor University. Her areas of specialization include ancient Mediterranean seafaring, sewn boat building traditions, so excited for that, paleoethnobotany, and archaeological palynology. She's currently co-principal investigator with the Albanian Ancient Shipwreck Project, which is working on-site assessments of shipwrecks off the southern coast near the UNESCO site of Butrint. Cool. Professor Willis is the AIA Steffey Lecturer for 2020-2021, as you can see right here. And without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Oh, thank you very much, Alex. And hi, welcome. Thank you very much for hosting me. I am very honored to be giving the Richard Steffey lecture. Now, I never knew Mr. Steffey myself, but his work was our absolute Bible in the nautical archaeology program at Texas A&M. The wooden ship building and the interpretation of shipwrecks by J. Richard Steffey was a must read for all first years. And Mr. Steffey not only taught us the difference between floors and futtocks and a flat scarf versus a Z scarf and where the mast step goes, but Mr. Steffey brought ships back to life. And he allowed us in a small way to meet the people who built them hundreds or even thousands of years ago, such as the Carina, the famous Carina ship that he's pictured working on here. Now, in this way, my own research builds on this foundation that Mr. Steffey provided. And today I want to tell you about a community of boat builders in the Northern Adriatic who passed down their tradition of boat building across at least 800 years and probably likely very much longer. But before I can tell you about them, I need to zoom out, no pun intended, with on Zoom and set the stage for us a little bit. So in the ancient Mediterranean, boats were seen as a watertight shell. The hull planks were joined together, built up, and then frames were only inserted later to provide some lateral support. So the essence of the boat was that shell of hull planking. And in the ancient Mediterranean, there were two main ways to join your planking. You could join it by mortise and tenon joints, or you can do it by sewing. Now, with sewn joinery, what we have here is that holes are being drilled along the internal face of the whole plank near to the edge of the plank. So it's what would be the inside of the boat. And usually some kind of fiber was placed along the seam of the two planks, and then cordage was used to literally sew the planks together, kind of like lacing up your shoe. And once you were done, you went and plugged up those holes with pegs or fibers or something. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, drilling holes into your watertight shell seems a bit counterintuitive, right? But this was actually a very common and very widespread method of boat building, both in the past and today, and way outside of the Mediterranean. So to give you a sense of this boat building technique, I thought I would take us to southern India, to the Kerala coast, where we actually have boat builders who build using a similar type of method even today. And here we see them repairing a sewn boat in this particular video clip. Couple things that I want you to notice here. Notice there's a person on the outside of the hull and a person on the inside of the hull. And the boat is built by passing the cordage back and forth between these individuals, right? Now, the planks are held together with these longitudinal seams of stitching, right? And on the inside of the plank, which we'll go back to here in a second, once he tightens up this particular bit of cordage. So the inside of the hull creates these longitudinal seams and often very distinct patterns where you can see that lacing on the inside. Now here he's plugging up the holes with some coconut fibers. The use of local materials is particularly consistent across cultures that use sewn boat building technologies, but you might notice that that cordage is actually synthetic. So that's also a trend we see. Now the frames are quite unique because you have to have these channels. He's carving a new channel in order to allow that longitudinal seam to pass underneath the frame. Notice also that he's putting the frame back in. With sewn boats, what we commonly have is detachable frames that you can take out so you can re-sew your boat and maintain it across multiple seasons of life. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how sewn boats are constructed, because I'm going to go a lot further into that for this specific region. So we see both methods, both mortise and tenon and sewing, wax and wane over time in the ancient Mediterranean. But eventually around the 4th century BCE, which is actually when that Kamacchio ship dates to, mortise and tenon seems to win. And this technique becomes really widespread across the entire Mediterranean. Essentially, you just have this one way of joining your planks together in the Mediterranean, except for in the northern Adriatic. Now, the upper Adriatic region represents this unique pocket of hull construction in the Mediterranean. It's the only area that maintained a large-scale production of sewn hull construction into the Roman era. And the majority of hull remains that have been discovered from the ancient Northwestern Adriatic employed this sewn joinery. While a few mortise and tenon holes have been excavated from this region, the sewn boats just absolutely dominate the nautical archaeological record. And my question has always been, why? Why did this particular local boat building tradition endure in a relatively small geographic region over an extended period of time? And at the time that I began this research, scholars mostly attributed the preservation of this tradition to the presence of lagoons and shallow inner waterways that pervade the landscape. And there's no doubt that the flexibility that a sewn hull offers makes it well adapted to an environment of shallow waters. However, This environmentally deterministic model leaves several factors unexplored that may have also contributed to the persistence of this method of boat building. Now, as an archaeologist with a background in anthropology, I wanted to explore the socio-cultural factors that may have influenced the retention of sewn boat building in this region. So this lecture is a deep dive into both the nitty-gritty of the boats themselves and into the broader context in which they were built. So it's an intensive analysis of the physical remains of sewn boats of the Northwestern Adriatic tradition in order to understand the technological choices of the ancient community of builders and to relate these strategies and processes to the larger discussion of constructing and maintaining local cultural identities in the negotiated periphery of colonial contexts. Sounds like a lot. So before diving in, let's establish our spatial and chronological boundaries that define the tradition of sewn boat building. So in space, we find the remains of these hulls primarily along the northwestern Adriatic coast between Aquileia to the north and the Po River Delta, with remains as far south as Cervia and as far inland as Padua and Oderzo. Whenever we look at time, this tradition spans anywhere from at least 800 to as potentially as much as 1600 years, with the earliest date being a wood fragment with some holes drilled along one side that dates to the 6th to 5th century BCE, and the latest date attributed to this tradition being the Pomposo Borgo Caprile remains that date to the 11th century CE. Now, both ends of this spectrum are disputed, but there's definitive evidence for this tradition starting in at least the 2nd century BCE and lasting until at least the 7th century CE. So either way you cut it, it's still a really long time. Now, while no definitive hull remains predate Roman colonization, I think it's highly likely that this tradition of boat building was well in use before the Romans showed up. Why? A few different reasons, but one of the big ones is I somewhat clunkily named this boat building tradition the Northwestern Adriatic, which I'm probably going to trip over a few times tonight. Hopefully you guys will forgive me. But I name it that because it's not the only sewn boats that are in this upper Adriatic pocket. There's actually a whole separate tradition in the eastern half, and then a third tradition kind of further up in the continent. And while all these traditions of sewn boats are similar in the sense that they're all sewn, there's actually a lot of differences between them that do warrant the separation into these distinct traditions. Now, recently, a sewn boat of the Eastern Adriatic tradition was radiocarbon dated to the late Bronze Age. So this was somewhere between the last quarter of the 12th century and the last quarter of the 10th century BCE. So while we haven't found any sewn boats of the Northwestern Adriatic tradition that are this old, I think it's really likely that the local inhabitants of northeastern Italy were making sewn boats well prior to our definitive 2nd century BCE date when we know that they were. So first up, we need to establish a little bit more context about the people who lived in this region during this time. Now, the population that inhabited this area of northeastern Italy were called the Veneti by later Roman authors. Now, if you're familiar with your ancient sources, these are not to be confused with the Atlantic Veneti, whom Julius Caesar defeated in a really hard-fought sea battle during his military campaigns in northern Gaul. Different Veneti. Instead, this is the Veneti of the Adriatic coast. And there's a story about the people who settled the northwestern coast of the Adriatic Sea, a story that is steeped in gravitas and epic heroes, a story that begins, as many do in the ancient Mediterranean, with the siege of Troy. And the story, at least according to Virgil, goes a little something like this. When Troy fell to the Greeks and the population of the city scattered before its invading army, the escape of a handful of key individuals was recorded. Now, the most famous of these fugitives was, of course, Aeneas, who sailed across the sea and settled in the Latin hills, whose progeny would eventually give rise to Rome. But a lesser-known escapee was Antenor, who, with his sons and a band of displaced Trojans known as the Veneti, also sailed west away from Troy. But he just turned north a little sooner and wound up in the Adriatic. And Antenor led his small band of refugees along dangerous coastlines teeming with piratical Illyrians and past treacherous surging river mouths to eventually arrive safely in the plains of the Po Valley. And there he established the city of Patavium, which we know of today as Padua, giving his Trojan charges a safe place to rest from their wanderings. Now, while Virgil provides the most detail, this story is also referenced by others too. We have Cato, Polybius, Livy, who himself was a native Paduan, Strabo, although he doubts the accuracy of the myth, and possibly Sophocles. And at 5th century BC, this would be the earliest recorded mention of this particular myth. Now, these ancient authors corroborate Virgil's origin myth, tying the Veneti into the Trojan cycle and into this shared mythological history with the Romans. And it's unknown and perhaps unlikely that the peoples of the Northwestern Adriatic coast actually originally traced their ancestry to a Trojan survivor. However, during the period in which Livy records his tale, it is possible that the local inhabitants had incorporated this origin myth into their own psyche. The presence of this Antenor myth in Virgil's account of Rome's foundation suggests a belief by at least some Romans that the Veneti were similar to themselves, that they were like a type of kin. And whether this was a mutual feeling held in common between these two culture groups, that's of course a little bit more difficult to determine. So, who were the ancient Veneti who occupied this region? Let's turn to the archaeology to get a better sense of the people here. And overall, the textual, epigraphic, and archaeological sources of the pre-colonial period point to a social political organization centered around an urban core with an active community of craftspeople and localized religious worship. And the distribution of Mycenaean boats in many cases maps directly onto these known Venetic urban centers. Now, key aspects of pre-colonial Venetic culture included the pivotal nature of the family and clan groupings as a social structure, the division of ritual votive offerings, cultic rites, and sanctuary sites by both age and gender, and a distinct social hierarchy as revealed through burial practices and significant differences between these major sites, which suggests civic identities that were developing at the city-state level. In fact, there's no evidence at this time for an ethnic identity that the ancient Veneti would have recognized as connecting themselves across these urban communities within the region. One scholar described the pre-colonial region as, quote, a constellation of largely independent local communities spread over this vast area that hosted a variety of local identities, dialects, and traditions. But still, they didn't live in isolation. The Veneti, situated as they were at the crossroads between the Italian peninsula and Central Europe, were in contact with other cultures, including the Etruscans to the southwest, the Greeks at Adria to the south, the Celts to the west and the north, and eventually, of course, with Rome. And through these interactions, the Veneti absorbed new practices, manners, and styles into their culture. And examples of this interconnection include a surge in Greek luxury goods in the 6th century BCE, as well as Etruscan influence on the Venetic script and iconography. So the big moment in time was in 181 BC, when the Romans founded a colony in the region at Aquileia on the Friuli Plain, ostensibly in order to protect the Veneti from the incursions of the Transalpine Gauls. And this generally serves as a boundary line, 181 BCE. The transition from pre-colonial to colonial, but of course, this wasn't a moment of colonialization or colonization. This was a process, right? A process that included a lot of things, like the construction of the Via Aemilia, which began shortly thereafter in the 170s BCE to connect the region to the rest of the Italian peninsula, or the Veneti fighting on behalf of the Romans in the social wars. And their participation in those conflicts led to them being awarded Latin rights afterwards, and then eventually granted full Roman citizenship in 49 BCE. And after that point, things really took off. There was a large colonizing movement between 49 and 14 BCE, with the founding of other Roman colonies, both at established Venetic urban centers like Este and Altino and Iulia Concordia, as well as others on virgin soil. Now, as discussed already, textual sources point toward an amicable relationship between this region and Rome. These historical sources primarily represent, though, an edict or outsider perspective of that colonial relationship between the Veneti and Rome. But there is an interesting set of artifacts that was discovered in the region, which provide some insight into the local attitudes, potentially. In the second half of the 4th century CE, so several centuries after colonization happened, or had kind of fully been implemented, a number of mile markers were erected along the Via Postumia, which cut across the northern part of the peninsula, running from Aquileia in the east to Genoa in the west. And on these mile markers was the inscription that you see here, which stated that whoever it was that erected these considered themselves, at least, to be devoted to the Roman emperors. And this devotion of the Veneti is actually a really common theme found throughout a variety of Roman literary sources. And it's a theme that is reflected in the Antenor origin myth. But these mile markers are kind of our only overt emic statement of devotion, purportedly from the people of the region itself. Now, of course, these artifacts can't be just digested uncritically, as that statement may not be representative of the feelings of the entire population, or even a majority. There could be lots of ulterior motivations for such a display. However, a local expression of faithfulness to an arguably ancestral ally and confederate also can't be overlooked. It's actually a pretty rare instance of self-identification by the people of this region, or at least one person, as Venetians, and their own acknowledgement of their relationship that they have with Rome. Now, Roman influence can be traced in the archaeological, epigraphic, and iconographic records of the region over the course of more than 100 years, so that by the 1st century BCE, when we start to get a lot of sewn boats dating, Roman presence in the region was pervasive and had affected many aspects of Venetic way of life, including political structures, urban landscape, economy, industry, religious, ritual practice, burial rites, language. It was pervasive. But the cultural change didn't happen as a lump sum. Instead, what we see here is the Veneti adopted these Roman cultural elements very gradually and as a piecemeal process. Now, Catherine Lomas is a classical archaeologist at Durham University, and she's done some pretty extensive research on cultural identity and change in this region, both before and after Roman colonization. And according to her, we can see this negotiation of Venetic cultural identity quite clearly in a collection of grave markers or stela that have been recovered from Padua. So 2 of which I have here on the slides just kind of serve as general examples of the collection. So in the examination of language use on the full set of grave markers, a complex process was seen by which some would choose to adopt Latin, though retain some local inscription formulas, while others retain their native Venetic, perhaps as a desire to highlight their local identity. We see a similar complex process of adoption of Roman iconography. And then to even further complicate things, the incorporation of Roman elements into the traditional iconography doesn't run directly parallel with the adoption of Latin as the language of inscription. So Lomas argues that this combination of both local and Roman ingredients indicates a sophisticated use of cultural symbols to create a composite personal identity, or what we could call a discrepant identity, recognizing that there are a multitude of ways that individuals at all levels of society negotiated cultural change in their public and private lives. And these indeed were very composite and very personal identities. In particular, there was a strong social pressure for Venetic elite males to present themselves in Roman regalia as a symbol of their citizenship status. Now, in the grave marker you see on the right, which dates to the colonial period, you can see the elite male at the back of the carriage, and he's wearing a toga, sporting a Roman style haircut, and posed in classic Roman fashion, hand and toga. But if we look at the female right next to him, his wife, we see something very different. She's dressed in a local Venetic costume that is long sleeve and full skirted and got a pinned cloak on. Atop her head, we see this headdress that's surmounted with a disc, which is of clear Venetic origin. A similar style of headdress is seen on other grave markers dating to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. So this social pressure to appear Roman does not seem to exist for the women, who have retained more of their local identity markers, the hairstyles, the clothing within these iconographic representations. Now, Lomas postulates that women had thus become the bearers of Venetic traditions during the Roman colonial period. And what I argue is that that same detachment from the political machinations of the local elite male community that characterized our elite women may be applicable to our non-elites in general. And in this sense, the absence of a politically induced drive to identify as Roman may have led non-elite portions of the Venetic population, such as the builders of the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats, to retain more of their elements of local cultural identity as well. So the context, the boat builders of this tradition were operating in a context of increasing interconnectivity with various peoples, customs, and technologies of the wider Mediterranean basin. They were practicing their craft in a context of continual and progressive entanglement, whereby foreign cultural elements were drawn into the local cultural fabric. Turning now specifically to the nautical landscape of the region, I wanted to see if there was any additional evidence for sewn boats or sewn boat builders outside of the remains of these hulls. Because while this region of northeastern Italy was very well known, lots of writing in the textual sources, for its extensive waterways, both natural and man-made, during both the pre-colonial and colonial periods, there are shockingly few images of boats in the archaeological record, or mentions of boats or boat builders in the ancient texts. One particular monument we do have was found in Aquileia. It's a monument to a boat builder, a faber navalis. It's been recovered. You can see it on the screen on the right. And while the boat that adorns this monument is very reminiscent of some of the earlier Venetic forms, like this bronze votive that dates to the 5th or 6th century BCE, there's no indication of the type of joinery that was used, and no way to verify the individual honored here was part of the community of sewn boat builders. The only possible connection to this sewn boat building community that I could find in the archaeological record was related to fibulas, which is the safety pin of the ancient world. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of these fibulas. They were excavated from votive pits at sanctuary sites. And the key thing about them is that some of them are decorated with what appears to be stitches, and others with the banded X pattern that's identical to what you see on the interior face of the planking of a sewn boat. Now, although the association of this decorated fibulas to sewn boats and the boat building community is certainly disputable, the use of stitching as an embellishing theme within the region where sewn boats are found is at least suggestive. Turning now to textual sources, only a handful of references concerning the boats used within the region have survived in the historical record. And perhaps the most useful for us is the minimal description of local Paduan boats that Livy provides. Once again, Livy being a native of this region and a native of Padua, included in his account of the attack of Cleonymus in the 4th century BCE. Okay, so in this tale, Cleonymus, the commander of a Spartan fleet in 301 BCE, led his army into the northern Adriatic, sailed up the modern Brenta River, and raided the villages in the territory of Patavium, modern-day Padua. Now, in Livy's dramatic narrative, the Patavini successfully defended their territory, cutting the enemy to pieces, and Cleonymus barely escaped complete annihilation. He retreated from the region with but 1/5 of his original fleet. And Livy attributes the triumph of the Patavini. He says it was largely due to their superior fleet, right? To the superior fitness of indigenous watercraft for navigating the local waterways. Livy talks about how armed Pataviti men piled into their riverboats, suitably constructed with flat bottoms, to enable them to cross these shallow lagoons, and thus they were able to descend upon the fleet of Cleonymus and surrounded the unwieldy ships of the enemy. Now, Livy also notes that 300 years later, the Patavini still held commemorative naval contests to honor this victory. And the only detail that Livy mentions is that the local boats had flat bottoms, which is actually exactly how one would describe the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats. They're all keelless, flat bottom boats. So with this, as we've seen, there's very little to no evidence for this community of sewn boat builders outside the remains of the boats themselves. Thus, the products of this community, the remains of the sewn boats they built, are singular in their potential to contribute significantly to our knowledge of their lifeways and identities. They're a repository of actions, the communal effort, the decisions of these craftsmen, none of which is preserved in texts, in inscriptions, or in iconography. And so it's to those remains that we're now going to turn. So within this tradition, at least right now, and I haven't had any updates from Italy in the last little bit, but right now we have 19 finds attributed to the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn tradition. 10 of these come from nearly complete or partial hulls, think shipwrecks, abandoned ships. All of them that we have so far are keelless, flat-bottom boats like the Cortecavanella Due and the Stella One boats you see here on the screen. But actually, a lot of the remains of this tradition of shipbuilding come from disarticulated planking and singular finds. Some planks were reused to shore up canal walls or to create riverside docks, or four-hull remains are completely without archaeological context at all. They washed ashore after a large storm, or they were just casually found. We're able to identify them as being part of this tradition because of the telltale signs of holes all along the edges of the planks. So when we look at this broad collection, we can identify two disparate hull types, two kind of broad ways of making a boat with this particular method. And the first type of hull is represented by the Stella One Boat, which is a mostly complete flat bottom river barge with a sharp turn of the bilge. The bilge is that transition from the bottom of the boat to the sides, turn of the bilge. And the Stella One is preserved at a length of just over 5 meters or 16 feet. And the other type of hull that we see with this tradition is represented by the Kamacchio Ship, which is a coastal or riverine craft. It had a rounded hull, a nice smooth turn of the bilge, and a thickened keel plank, but not a true keel. It's been reconstructed to a length of about 21 meters or 70 feet, so much bigger than our Stella One river barge. The Kamacchio hull also exhibits a special case of mixed construction. Although the entire bottom of the vessel is joined together using this sewn tradition, we do have some regularly spaced mortises cut into the top of the first whale. Now, unfortunately, we don't have anything else above this whale, so we don't know if the construction went back to sewn or continued in mortise and tenon from this point. But what the Kamacchio Ship does provide is evidence for the coexistence of these two separate traditions of boat building, likely within the same shipyard, if not within the same builder. Intriguingly, a more recent find out of Padovitera was a large riverboat that dates to the 5th century CE, so a few hundred years later. And it shows also a dual method of construction. Once again, the entire bottom is built using this same sewn tradition, but the sides and the upper parts of the hull are built using lapstrake or clinker construction. Now, lapstrake technology is where you overlap the planks over top of one another, and then you rivet them together, right? So you're still building your shell up first and then inserting your frames, but this one you're overlapping the planks, riveting them together. And it's a method of construction we see in Central and Northern Europe. Perhaps most famous are the Vikings. They used it. So their ships have that quite distinctive look. If you've seen a Viking ship, that's lapstrake or clinker construction. Okay, so either the builders of these separate traditions collaborated on these vessels, or the builder in the region were capable of using multiple methods of construction. Now, within these boat building techniques, we're seeing something we were already seeing with the rest of the archaeological record. We see how these builders are connected to the technologies both of the Mediterranean basin with mortise-and-tenon and to that of Central and Northern Europe with this clinker construction. Now, one of the main goals of this research was to make sense of this jumble of finds. I needed to organize everything and then try to identify patterns in the data. Now, as I was interested in possibly unraveling the decision-making strategies of the builders, I focused on two technological stages. First, resource procurement, and second, manufacturing. Furthermore, I looked for patterns within the data by sorting each set of hull remains, first by vessel type, as we kind of just went over. Is this a coastal trader like the Kamacchio Ship, or is it a river barge like the Stella One Boat? Now, what we don't have in the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn tradition is a true seagoing ship, a vessel with a keel that would have made it a good sailor on open sea waters. But recently, washed ashore on the barrier island of the Venice Lido, or the barrier island of the Venice Lagoon, Venice Lido, was a bunch of disarticulated planks that included this timber. And one of the most striking elements of this timber is not just how thick it is, and it's a beast, it's thick, but it's also clearly tapered. One edge of the plank is 7.5 centimeters and the other is 4.8 centimeters. And this tapering of the plank is a distinctive feature of what's known as a garboard strake. That's the plank that's attached to the keel. It transitions from the thickness of that keel to the thickness of the rest of the hull. And this timber may be evidence of a seagoing ship. If it is a garboard strake for a vessel that had a true keel, it would be our first known seagoing ship of this particular tradition. However, without more of the remains, I went ahead and just classified the timbers that were found on Venice Lido as a coastal trader, because we at least know it was off the coast, because that's where it came from. Okay, in addition to tracing patterns by vessel type, I also traced chronologically, based primarily here on date of deposition, because that's mostly what I have, though I also use felling or harvesting dates. Those were used when only radiocarbon dates were known. And then I also traced patterns by sub-region, using the modern day regions of Italy, as well as placing everything in geographic order from east to west and north to south. So those modern boundaries would have held no significance during ancient times, but I used them because they do permit a general geographic sorting or grouping around the Po Delta, near the Veneto Lagoon, and in the plain surrounding Aquileia, and that grouping may have been meaningful in the past. So, of the 19 likely boat remains of this tradition, 12 of them have been partially analyzed for wood and fiber identification. While not exhaustive, there were over 100 samples analyzed for the Kamacchio wreck, so that one actually permits the most complete picture of materials used within a single vessel. And there are clear trends in resource procurement that were observed. First, elm for hull planking. Second, oak for frames. Now, this particular trend has been noted in earlier studies. And while new finds mostly continue the trend, we are starting to see some nuances here, such as spruce and cypress for hull planking and fraxinus for frames. But overall, overwhelmingly, boat after boat after boat, elm for the hull planking, oak for the frames, both of which are hard woods. Now, fibers have been preserved less frequently than wood. There's a consistent pattern of Tilia bast for the seam wadding and esparto grass for the cordage, right? So that's another consistency that we're seeing. In fact, that's the only fibers that have been identified from this sewn tradition. They're just not preserved nearly as often. The pegs and the trunnels, on the other hand, vary considerably. But first, what's a trunnel? My boaty terms always usually come back to bite me, so I'm trying to stay ahead of them. So a trunnel is like a wooden nail. We use the trunnels were used to attach the frames to the hull itself. So if you see all the holes that are in the top of the frames on the drawing of the Stella One barge, yeah, that's the trunnels, right? And even when the frames themselves are gone, the trunnels often still remain, like in the Corte-Cavanella Due hull that you see there. And the presence of those trunnels can give us at least some sense of the framing system, right? How far apart those frames were spaced if you know where the trunnels were. Now, as far as resource procurement is concerned, there were 5 different types of wood that were used to manufacture trunnels within this tradition. Dogwood was actually the most frequently used material across the boats sampled. Now, in addition to trunnels, we also have those pegs, those tapered cylindrical wooden wedges used to plug up the holes. You had 6 different types of wood that have been identified so far as material used to manufacture these pegs. Most common types here were fir, lime, and dogwood. Now, this frequent use of dogwood is quite intriguing. Dogwood is a medium to large shrub, and it's quite hard, but it's not frequently used to manufacture products of any kind because of its size restrictions. I mean, it's fine for pegs and trunnels, things that are pretty small, but it's usually not used for much else or anything else. And in fact, to my knowledge, there are no other instances of dogwood being employed in Mediterranean shipbuilding outside of the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats, though I'm still looking for comparanda on that. Okay, so if we look at the full picture here, 4 of the 7 hull remains with both pegs and trunnels identified incorporated the same type of wood for both components. And more often than not, the wood that was interchangeable was dogwood, was the cornice that you're seeing on the screen. And that includes the builders of the Kamacchio Ship, the Corte-Cavanella Due, and the Venice Lido 3 vessels. All of those fashioned at least some of both pegs and trunnels from dogwood. And our other example of this is the Stella One barge, where the builders of that vessel used fir to make at least some of both pegs and trunnels. So this leads to a possible pattern in materials used by subregion, as most of the fir that's being used, the abies on the screen, was used in the vessels found in the Friuli Plain. And this may make sense, as this region is closer to those high mountainous Alps where fir would have grown more abundantly. Furthermore, lime wood was not used for any of the pegs or the trunnels. That's the tilia on the screen. And so it wasn't used at all for the pegs and trunnels of any of those sewn boats found in or near the Friuli Plain, despite it being a really common type of wood that was used in boats further south. In fact, as tilia lime or tilia is used solely with vessels identified so far as coastal traders, this also introduces a possible materials use by type of vessel as well. So is the incorporation of lime wood a factor of functionality of different types of vessels, or local preference availability, or some combination of both? There are, of course, many factors that impede the interpretation of this potential pattern: the absence of sewn coastal traders in all regions, the limited numbers of samples that have been identified across all known vessels of this tradition, and the big one for nautical archaeologists, the inherent mobility of boats, such that a boat can be deposited in a very different region from where it was built. And I only, of course, know right now where it was deposited. So, final remark here on our resource procurement. I have to make a comment about the use of this esparto grass, because it really is quite noteworthy. This particular type of grass only grows in Spain and North Africa. So it would have been an import. And based on textual and archaeological evidence, it only would have been available, or would have become available in the central Mediterranean after the imperial expansion of Rome into the Iberian Peninsula. And it's not surprising at all that they started using this foreign import over locally available materials. Esparto grass is very well suited for making cordage, but particularly something that's going to be constantly wet. In fact, Pliny talks about how esparto grass is nourished by water. So in this case, the foreign import would have been superior to anything available locally. Now, intriguingly though, the use of esparto grass cordage connected these builders to those broader colonial and commercial processes at play throughout the Mediterranean. And thus they became reliant on wider mechanisms of exchange and power imbalances outside the region where they built their boats. Now, once those raw materials were procured, they had to be processed into planks, frames, pegs, trunnels, seam wadding, and cordage, right? And then all combined together to form the whole. So planks were cut to varying thicknesses, somewhere between 2 and 10 centimeters, although most of the planking used in this tradition was 5 centimeters or less. Now there's a very clear pattern here by plank thickness. Perhaps unsurprisingly, coastal traders had much thicker hull planks than the river barges. So one kind of easily identifiable pattern in this tradition. Okay, so the sewing channels were drilled and gouged diagonally from the internal face to the edge of the plank. At that point, a trapezoidal or rectangular cavity was cut along the plank edge to widen the opening to the channel, possibly here to facilitate the sewing process. This would have permitted a much larger margin of error when aligning the channels of adjacent planks. Now, these sewing channels ranged in diameter from 10 to 28 millimeters, right? So 1 to 2.8 centimeters, so within a couple centimeters of each other, with no discernible pattern by date, subregion, type of vessel, or any other construction feature like plank thickness. And this range in diameter is sometimes seen in singular finds. So one plank will have both a hole that's 10 millimeters and one that's 20 millimeters. So this likely represents aberrations in handcrafted tools, as well as the skill of the individual builder. Now, the spacing of the sewing channels is typically between 5 and 10 centimeters. Again, no detectable pattern here by any observed factor. So all of this is suggesting kind of a common system of measurement across the builders of these traditions, but probably a very informal one, such as finger widths. Now, once the holes were drilled and the edge cavities were cut, a wad of twisted bast fibers were placed along that seam, and then the esparto grass cordage was used to sew the planks together in this distinctive cross-stitched pattern with clamping turns that created the X motif on the inside of the boat. And the number of passes of cord likely varied quite a bit between both between and within vessels, with more passes of cord likely being used on more structurally important areas of the ship. Now, after sewing was completed, of course, the channels were all plugged with tapered pegs, and then you could start putting in your frames. So there are 2 broad patterns of framing that were observed in the mostly complete holes that have survived where a system could actually be detected. And those 2 broad patterns are the Stella One has made frames of floor timbers with attached futtocks, attached with wooden trunnels, while the builders of the Kamacchio Ship, by contrast, also had large floor timbers, but then extended the sides by inserting futtocks in between. Now, I realize that's a lot of boat talk there, but the key thing that you need to know about this part is that neither one of these framing patterns that they employed in the boats that we have preserved were the typical alternating floors and half frames pattern that was used by contemporary Mediterranean shipbuilders. So in order to explore the location and season of manufacture of the materials of the sewing system in particular, and perhaps of the hull itself, I conducted a pollen analysis. This is that paleoethnobotany and archaeological palynology part coming out. So I did a pollen analysis of the seam wadding and cordage from the sampled, or from 3 different Northwestern Adriatic Sewn vessels. So of the samples that were collected, 11 yielded at least 50 grains, which is kind of our standard baseline for interpretation. Now, first off though, before we can interpret the results of a pollen analysis, you have to understand how and when the pollen was integrated into the material. Because pollen can act like a fingerprint. It gives you data on location and season of manufacture. Different parts of the world have a different pollen spectrum. And of course, different things pollinate at different times of the year. So if you have a whole lot of certain species or certain genera in your pollen spectrum, you can tell the difference between like early spring and, summer. So as far as when and where this pollen became integrated into these fiber materials from my boats, I argue it's likely that the majority of this pollen present in these materials were introduced during the manufacturing stage. In particular, a stage that almost all fibers go through, something called a retting stage, where the raw materials are soaked in water for several weeks. So while they were going that process of soaking in water, they would have accumulated a lot of the local pollen that was present within that vat of water. Now, overall, most of our cordage samples from the Stella One barge and the Venice Lido 3 hull remains compare really favorably with paleo-environmental reconstructions of southeastern Spain. There's lots of dry and arid climate types of plants that are represented within this pollen spectrum, as well as a few like high mountain things that we wouldn't have seen in North Africa. And this suggests that the cordage was most likely manufactured in Spain and then shipped to Italy. So they're not shipping the grass, they're shipping the pre-manufactured cordage. The sea modding samples for both the Stella One barge and the Canale Amphorae 2 hull remains, however, compare very favorably with paleo-environmental reconstructions of northeastern Italy. And thus, they may actually represent the environment of the shipyard itself. And based on the high percentage of some certain genera and families, hackberry and carrot, it actually seems like the manufacturing process would have been going on in late spring. So that's when those particular genera are very active. Now, this analysis of these two technological stages of Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats, resource procurement and manufacture, revealed both stable and dynamic features. The features that remain stable over time and across this region indicate the foundational aspects of the tradition, the ones that were passed down most carefully and assiduously from one generation to the next. They're kind of your general guidelines, your basic mental template of what comprised a sewn vessel of this tradition. And as you can see, these stable features are mostly centered around the sewing system itself. On the other hand, the dynamic features potentially represent the training and decisions of individual communities of builders within the broader tradition. So as such, within this technology, we have both a general strategy or approach to boat building, as well as multiple innovative solutions and preferences within that strategy. So revealing both a regional boat building community and distinct groups of builders within the community. So how do these technological choices, the stable tradition of the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats correlate to identity? So to explore this question, I had to return to my anthropological roots and broaden my net to include ethno-archaeological studies of other technologies, as well as ethnographies of modern sewn boats. These stretch across significant geographical distances, as most of the case studies here are largely from sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. Now, while I'm not proposing that all decision-making strategies and identity-building processes are identical across time and space, I do contend that these two data sets provide really insightful analogies to the shared human experience of creating, maintaining, and negotiating identities through embodied practice. So there are several examples I could give from the ethno-archaeological case studies where technical variation represents intentional strategies to mark group identity, but interest of time, just going to cover a couple. In particular, one case study done among Nigerian potters found that clay processing recipes acted as technical signatures to distinguish members of specific potting communities. So the scholar here, Olivier Gosselin, notes that the two shaping techniques noted in the study region are socially demarcated as well as perceived to have advantages in each separate community. So this highlights how a technical behavior can have a perceived functional attribute concurrently with a social or cultural marker. Now, another study, this one of potters in the Andhra Pradesh region of Southeast India, noted that technical variation was a factor of subcaste divisions, matrimonial networks, and dialectical groupings. Specifically, the forming process of handmade jars was correlated to subcaste divisions, and the body positions that the potters were in during the forming process varied by dialectical groupings. Now, these anthropological studies of other technologies provide a precedent for linking or for the link between constructing identity concurrently with constructing things. Now, moving on to the ethnography of sewn boats, unfortunately, most of the ethnographic accounts of modern sewn boats focus primarily, if not exclusively, on the construction elements of the boats themselves. We boat people really like our boats. And these ethnographies only make passing references to the sociocultural context of the builders themselves. However, there are still a few key trends that stand out from a look at the ethnography of modern sewn boats. First, the use of local handcrafted resources in most occurrences. There is some shift to prefabricated or synthetic materials. Most often cross-culturally, this is actually with the cordage, as we saw with that sewn boat along the Kerala coast at the beginning here. Second, I also noted the use of needles and pokers to facilitate the passage of the cordage through the sewn channels. These are actually really evocative of the abundant bronze artifacts that are currently identified as writing styluses dedicated at Venetic sanctuary sites. Could these, in fact, be sewing needles of Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boat builders? Intriguingly, dedicated at this same sanctuary site as these thin metal objects, there are fibulas decorated with a cross-stitched X pattern identical to the sewing pattern of the vessel. So those fibulas that I talked about earlier are found in the same sanctuary site as these artifacts here. And then finally, the third key trend was the arrangement of two sewers working in tandem on opposite sides of the growing hull, with the inside man being the more senior who directed the work when the relationship was known. And this passage of cordage back and forth from one person to another is also captured in a Polynesian shipbuilder's song, a song that inspired actually the title of this talk. The words of the song go a little something like this: thread it from the inside, it goes outside. Thread it from the outside, it comes inside. Tie it firmly, bind it fast. And as evidenced by the ethnographic record, a sewn boat is an inherently social entity. In recorded practice, it's not constructed by just one person. Sewn boat building technologies require the maintenance of traditional knowledge and skills through the social structure of a community. And to date, scholars have explained the preservation of this tradition based on the material advantages of the boat itself. But of course, humans are more than a material being, and to more fully understand the nature of this preservation, I argue that the sociocultural has to be taken into account. Not to say material explanations are not also meaningful. Instead, the significance here is to start developing a discussion about understanding the potential social and cultural factors that could have contributed to the continuation of the boat building tradition within this colonial context. And this is what I want to close on, what I think is the most intriguing aspect of these boats, because the vessels themselves should be considered as insightful diagnostic artifacts in the narrative of cultural contact between the Romans and the native populations. And it's good to keep in mind that the entanglement of local inhabitants into the process of expanding Roman imperialism and the incorporation of Roman cultural elements into the local landscape was not inevitable, right? There's nothing inherent in either Roman power structures or material culture that irrevocably compelled the unfolding of these events. In fact, the perspective that Roman imperialism was this grand sweeping force that overpowered the ancient world overlooks the very real and very singular experiences of individuals and communities. But these builders did become entangled in the process, and this research highlights some of the consequences of that encounter. Now, to review, the textual and archaeological records present this unique relationship between the Veneti and the Romans as friends, allies, and perhaps even distant kin, metaphorically, if not biologically. Right? And the devotion of the Veneti is a prevalent theme in Roman literature and perhaps also represents an emic sediment, if we believe those mile markers. And on the ground, this relationship was augmented by gradual accumulation of Roman material culture over the course of several centuries. Based on the piecemeal and lengthy process of this changing material culture, many scholars argue that this was a voluntary process. Furthermore, Lomas stresses the flexible and dynamic concept of personal identity reflected in the material culture of the region, and the strong receptivity on part of the Veneti towards adopting foreign or adapting foreign elements to express distinctive local cultural identity. And currently, there's no evidence to support a claim that the relationship wasn't anything other than this depiction of general harmony. However, the regional archaeological record and the preservation of this sewn tradition does promote a more nuanced understanding of the spirit of amicability and social cooperation, and that's of discrepant experience. So those grave markers from Padua, and to some extent the life and writings of Padavium's most famous citizen, Livy, underscore the proclivity of local elite males to identify as Roman, whereas elite females were instead the keepers of traditional practice. Thus, elite women had a different experience of Roman imperialism than elite men. Now, the builders of the Northwestern Adriatic Sewn boats also had their own experience of the imperial process. And by practicing their craft within a community of fellow builders, they learned, inherited, and passed on a tradition that tied them to a craft community that spanned centuries. And in this sense, their experience of Roman imperialism was marginal, right? Yet they were not entirely isolated. The diversity of practices observed in relation to framing patterns suggests that this element of construction was particularly susceptible to modification and perhaps showed signs of external influence. Furthermore, their collaborations with builders of mortise-and-tenon and clinker technology, or their limited adoption of these techniques, connected them with the larger Mediterranean and European methods of ship construction. Finally, their use of cordage spun from grass grown far outside their region joined them to the broader economic structures established by Roman conquest. Now, it's uncertain how aware the builders of this tradition were of these phenomenon, or how much their connection to these larger machinations influenced their daily lives. However, the preservation of this tradition, perhaps as an aspect of their group identity as builders, emphasizes the importance of local community to their most fundamental experience. Perhaps even more so, as the most stable elements of this technology were related to the communal action of the sewing itself. Because the practice of building a sewn boat, the cutting of the lacing channels, the shared work of passing and pulling and tying the cordage, those bodily motions of joining one plank to the next over a series of in-grade movement created a shared experience that linked each builder to a community of practice that spanned a millennium. Now, anthropological approaches demonstrate that craftsmen and artisans often use technical behaviors to create and maintain group identity. The consistency and persistence of a definable tradition of sewn boat building in this region likely represents a community of builders who actively and intentionally preserve their inheritance as a facet of their identity through the twists and strokes and passes of cord that bound together more than just a boat. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. Now, since this is being recorded, let me also briefly pause and give my bibliography for my image credits, just in case anybody wants to go track down any of the images that I used within this lecture. But at this stage, I'll open it back up for Q&A.
Fantastic. Yeah. And thank you very much, Dr. Willis, for giving that. That was extremely interesting. And as somebody who has dealt with a lot of these ideas of persistence and indigeneity or indigenousness, it's very, very fascinating in the Mediterranean. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A queue, I guess you might call it, which are very, very interesting. So I'm going to start out there, but if anybody does have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A comment area, or you can raise your hand. I did see one hand being raised, and I'll get to those in just a moment. But that first question was from Jerome. Was there a late Bronze Age sewn boat tradition from the Northern Aegean that could be a progenitor of the Adriatic tradition?
Until this Bronze Age boat was found off the coast of Croatia, the Zambrancho wreck, the oldest sewn boats that we had in the Mediterranean were Greek, or were at least called Greek boats. So we find them off the coast of Marseille, off the coast of France. And in general, we have a lot of what are called Greek sewn boats. So that was a hypothesis for a long time, that the tradition that we see within the Northern Adriatic was a descendant of those earlier Greek tradition of sewn boat building. I will say that the Northwestern Adriatic version of this particular type of sewing your boat together does look to have some elements that were influenced from the Greek tradition. The Eastern Adriatic one, though, does not. It's quite distinct how different that particular one is. So I actually think that they're probably the older one. Now, how much cultural contact there was between the Eastern Adriatic tradition of sewn boats and the Greeks, that's a good question that we would love to have answered over time. But yes, good question.
Tough questions, good stuff. I want to try switching over to the raised hands for a second here. See, we'll kind of bounce back and forth, because why not, right? So I'll go to Jennifer Ramsey, I should say Dr. Ramsey, who is actually my boss. Allowed to talk. So Jen, I don't know if you can hear us. You just have to unmute your, yeah, perfect.
Oh, hi. I didn't know I raised my hand, actually.
Oh, my apologies. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I thought it was an amazing talk, though. It was so interesting, and all the things on indigeneity and the different traditions. I hadn't quite formulated a question yet, but I will.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you then.
I'm sorry about that. I must have hit the wrong button when I was moving my screen, but it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. It was just so interesting. And I do archaeobotany in the Near East. So again, this whole indigeneity thing is really near and dear. So thank you very much. I'm sorry. I'll take my hand down.
Oh, that's bound to happen, but that's still, an awesome presence. We have a question from James on the question and answer. Were they able to consistently use the special grass cording throughout the entire tradition? For example, it must have been harder to source after the Vandal and Arab invasions in Spain.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would also love to know what they used before esparto grass. Unfortunately, the cordage just doesn't preserve. We've literally tested, we haven't tested all the wood as far as identifying species, though more and more, the ones that are not identified are ones that were found back in the 60s and then reburied, and we just haven't gone back out to re-dig them up and find them and sample them. But anything that's new and that's being excavated is being sampled for materials, kind of resource procurement analysis. But I don't know. That's a question I would love to see answered. But we just have so few cordage samples from these boats that have been preserved, and that's also just true generally in the archaeological record, right? We can't even. It's even more difficult to tell, even if I'm not just looking at the boats. Though honestly, the boats are the most likely place that it'll survive, being constantly waterlogged and buried like that, the way a wrecked boat would be. So unfortunately, I can only speak to a very narrow period because that's all the remains I have.
That makes sense. Yeah, and a selfish question on my part. Do you have any idea what they might have used beforehand? Like, was there any sort of...
Probably. I mean, the lime bast that is used along the seam wadding, you can make cordage out of that.
Okay.
So flax could have also been potentially used, but the esparto grass would have been the obvious choice once it was available.
That's good stuff. Esparto grass is really interesting. A lot of cool research on that. Andrew McGee, I don't know if you want to try talking. I'm going to allow you to talk. I saw your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, so my question was about, and matter of fact, it's helpful that it's on the screen, the Stella One barge. It seems to have these straight lines, for cording, but then it has these little snaky ones in between spots. I was curious what those represent.
Those are repairs. Yeah, so all of those snaky lines in between, the boat cracked. And so they went back in and stitched up your repairs with that. Which, like, I focus a lot on the builders, but there's also this potential idea that the builders are also the users of the boat, that would go back in and repair it whenever it gets cracked. So yeah, so we do see a lot of repairs on these boats as well, and that's what all those other snaky bits are.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Cool. And David Ryan on the Q&A asks if you've used dendrochronology to date any of these planks.
I would love to use dendrochronology. Now, in a lot of cases, we don't have enough lines, enough rings in order to get it. So also the Southern Mediterranean is, of course, the dendrochronology database is not nearly as built up as like Northern Europe, right? So you would probably need, I've been told, an estimate of like 50 or 60 rings in order to get a dendro date in the Southern Mediterranean. And without a keel, that's the thing, is that usually whenever you're dendrochronology dating a boat, you have much thicker bits of the boat. And since my boats don't have keels, it makes dendro a little bit less viable. So, unfortunately, yeah, no, none of the boats yet have been dendrochronology dated. I'd love to do it if I ever eventually can, and have the money, right, for it.
Yes. Very well, I guess I don't know myself, because I also work in the Mediterranean where trees don't survive, but the rings are all like weird. But yeah, no, absolutely. I'm gonna jump around a little bit because we do have a bunch of questions here, and I'll come back to you, Jerome, in just a moment. But Renato Perucchio also asks, do you see any connection with the Egyptian tradition of boat building as exemplified by the Khufu's solar boat of 2650 BC?
So Khufu's barge, Khufu's boat does use, it is technically also a sewn boat. Sewn boat can be really broad. This particular tradition that I do is known as a sewn plank boat because it has these longitudinal seams where it's all sewn up along the plank. With Khufu's barge, this might be difficult to describe. They're actually more like lashing the planks to one another. So instead of having these longitudinal seams of stitches that go all the way down, instead we have channels cut into the planks going transverse across the plank, and then they're kind of running the cordage down there and lashing them together. They're also using mortise-and-tenon though on that. Though not pegged mortise-and-tenon because they didn't want to drill holes through the planks underneath the waterline. So Egyptian ship construction is complicated. So it is very broadly speaking in that same tradition of just sewn boats, boats that use some kind of cordage or lashing or stitching to hold it together. But it's got a lot of different quirks to it. So probably not an ancestor of what's going on here in the Northern Adriatic. They're quite different.
Jumping back to Jerome, has a chemical study been done on the woods used in the hull construction to see if the wood was soaked in a preservative?
Yes. So I do have some resin analysis that's been done, and it is, like most things in the Mediterranean, pine tar. So yeah, so a step that I skipped over. Once you finish your hull, you do soak it in pine tar to also help to make it more watertight as well. So yes.
Cool. Also my favorite type of soap. Anyways, so David Stork also asks, how are these boats propelled? Was it by oars, poles, masts? Was it different if it was in rivers versus the sea?
Yeah, the Kamacchio had a mast. Mast up was preserved, so that was definitely a single-masted boat for that one. There's no indication of propulsion for the barge, so it's possible that it could have been poled on that one. The river that it was in, perfectly feasible that it could have been poled. But we do, especially on some of those coastal traders, have a mast, so it would have been a sailed vessel.
That's cool. Yeah, there's cool stuff there. But going back to Jerome Brown, is there any evidence of the use of some kind of natural epoxy for bonding or as a preservative as well?
Nothing beyond the pine. The pine tar is really the only kind of resinous or kind of chemical agent that was applied to the boats. So no evidence for anything else.
Okay, that makes sense. Looks like, yeah, there's a few other technical questions here, which are great. Is there any evidence of laminated timber being used in antiquity for framing your whole skins?
Sorry, I'm not sure I heard that one.
This one, again from Jerome, is there, oh, wow, oh, oops, I lost it. I'm sorry, I destroyed it.
Okay.
My apologies.
No, I'm trying to find them in the Q&A where
Yeah.
you read them, but I didn't find it fast enough, and then for some reason your mic cut out and I didn't quite hear it.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, they're kind of cutting out. But the next question on there, is there any evidence of any coating being used as whole anti-fouling?
Yeah, no, nothing else beyond the so like some ancient Mediterranean hulls are like sheathed in lead or copper or something. This none of the hulls of this particular tradition have been so coated.
For sure.
And that's probably because most of them are spending most of their time in fresh water. So the likely, like the needing to protect from the things like shipworm, it was not nearly as pervasive in this tradition. Now, the timbers that washed ashore on Venice Lido, those suckers definitely had a lot of shipworm damage. So once again, if we ever do find a seafaring ship, we might see some elaborations of that on those types of hulls.
Very cool. Just going down the list, were there any similarities in the construction of chariots or architectural structures with the techniques used in boat construction? Or do those survive, actually? That's the question.
I'm going to be honest and say that I actually know nothing about the construction of chariots. My guess is that they're using mortise-and-tenon joinery in order to do that. I do know that they recently found that chariot that, like, the Rolls Royce of the ancient world in Pompeii. But I just looked at the pretty pictures. I didn't look at so I'm sorry, that one I'm not going to be able to answer.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, everybody should go check out the what they call it, the Ferrari of chariots from Pompeii.
Yes, okay, yeah, it was the Ferrari, it wasn't the Rolls Royce.
Oh, I mean, tomato at that point, but it's a pretty cool thing there. So an anonymous attendee asks, what is the most prominent improvement of the Adriatic Sewn boats compared to the funerary boats of Egypt? That's a tough one, but your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, they of course were serving two very, very different functions. I mean, the funerary boats of Egypt were meant to be taken apart and stored in pieces, right? So they had that mobility to deconstruct. And while you can sort of kind of deconstruct these hulls, my boats are actually not nearly as deconstructible as most sewn boats. I showed you that video of Kerala, or sorry, of the Kerala coast, where them putting the frame back in. These frames were trunnelled, which is a more permanent fixture of a frame. So in order to remove the frames to repair the hull, they would have had to cut the frame out entirely and then potentially retrunnel it to the hull or something, which we don't really see a lot of evidence for. So that's a little confusing. That's honestly a question that I still have about this tradition, is why in the world are you attaching the frames in this manner, making it less easy to maintain the hull itself? But anyway, I mean, that's my initial thought whenever I read this question, is that those funerary boats are meant to be disassembled and then reassembled, but mostly disassembled and buried so that the pharaoh can take it with him. And this boat is meant to, at least stick around and be used for a while. So it has more rigidity to it. Awesome.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool explanation of this. That's great. And the next question I think is quite fascinating as well from Sarah Horvat, which is what types of boat patterns / stitching / stylings are mimicked in fabric, clothing, ceramics, basketry, wares, architecture, and seafarers that may indicate their lifestyle or employ. Are they repeated designs? And I know that the preservation in this region is not great. So I don't know what you think about that.
It is not, and this is also another question that is getting a bit beyond my knowledge base. Certainly something that would make a good like future research. How could I connect this with other crafts in the area that use sewing or stitching? I mean, I'm most intrigued by the connections that seem to be potentially on the ground there, that women might have been involved in this process as the stitchers, as those, you know, kind of local keepers of the traditions. But still very tentative, which is why I didn't throw it into the main talk. But I also think that there could be some connections to some other crafts. I'm just not familiar enough with them in the region and the level of preservation.
I have a kind of related question to that. The sewing tradition and the sort of shared practice. You mentioned that it's like a persistence of tradition, which I really love that sort of way of thinking about it. Has anybody asked you, or do you consider it to be at all subversive or unconscious or anything along those lines? Because a lot of people sometimes use resistance in this case.
Right, yeah. I guess I probably like personally perceive it as a little bit of resistance to the, you know, further colonial process. We don't have any holes in the holes that are mortise and tenon are showing up later in that colonial period, but they're very limited within the regions. So they're, you know, if there are a couple of shipyards in the region that are producing these mortise and tenon, fully mortise and tenon boats, it's not very common, right? It's a very uncommon thing. So I don't have a lot of strong evidence to suggest yet whether or not it could be seen as something subversive, but potentially maybe. So I mean, it's definitely a process by which they are selectively incorporating some of the external elements, some of those foreign elements, like that cordage, but they're definitely not taking all of it. So it could be potentially seen as, yeah. But like I said, most of the textual sources, most of the they rave about the devotion of the Veneti, about the devotion of the people of this region. So I mean, maybe this is, you know, you know, community of builders that's saying, you know, I'm not devoted as I'm lacing up my boat, but yeah, it's a little difficult sometimes to get past those textual sources to those people that didn't write them, and, you know, we don't have their thoughts, those non-elites that these boat builders would have been.
Non-elites. I'm just imagining some like anti-Roman like sea shanties being sung while they're sewing these boats. But
I'm so happy that sea shanties had their like small little time in popular culture.
They did. Oh, we got to bring them back. George Halekas asks, what types of Roman boats would have been common off the coast of Veneti? And a related question may be from the anonymous attendee, what technology ended the sewn boat use?
So the technology that likely ended it would have been frame first technologies.
Okay.
So at the end of the period where we have definitive dates, what we have in the broader transition in the broader Mediterranean is a transition from what we call shell-based technology or shell-first technology, where you're building up your shell and then putting in the frames, to frame-based or frame-first technology. You build, which is a completely different way to think about your ship, right? You build up the skeleton of it, and then you just wrap it in planking. So the boat is not in the shell, the boat's in the frames. And once we introduce that, then you can start to get a whole bunch of architectural development by having, guide frames, frames that are specifically designed in the shape in order to control the shape of your boat. Because in shell-based, the shape of your boat is determined by how those planks bend as you build them up. It's not based on frames at all. Versus having frame-based technology, you can do a lot more with the design. You can have a lot more control over it. And that's ultimately how you can build bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger ships. And that's what we see take off in the Mediterranean, is the frame-based technologies. I mean, that's how ships are built today, is essentially frame-based. So that's what was the end. But we don't get to that until, kind of the end of this particular time period. So, fully frame-based, the 11th century Circe Lawane, 11th century AD, you have some transition before that. So.
For sure. And the like typical Roman boat that you might see off the coast at this time.
Oh, right. Typical Roman boat. Yeah. I mean, actually, hold on. I think I included, did I stop sharing?
You did, but that's okay.
I mean, I didn't mean to, but if you want to know what a Roman ship would have looked like, I have a bunch of just like random things that I laid down in here. As far as iconographically, what a Roman ship looked like would have been something like these guys. As far as like this ship over here, this is a nice little Roman looking ship. So that's what those would have looked like off the coast. I mean, probably not like the little head in the middle or something, but that general shape was a typical Roman seagoing ship. But they would have definitely been all made out of mortise-and-tenon joinery. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. We the other side of the Mediterranean, the West, we get a lot of very bad Roman seafarers. They're always somehow crashing their ships. I don't know how, but so Stephen Fox asks, and we'll just have like one or two more questions. I thank you for having. This is the most questions I think we've ever had. It's fantastic. The graphic shown, so what we were just showing before, looks like a boat that might be hard to handle in adverse conditions. You hypothesize that the builders may have been the users. What is known about the seafaring abilities of the builders, and how might have their ability influenced design?
Yes, well, once again, these things would not have been very good in adverse conditions. Especially these are riverboats, right? These are not meant to be on the open sea like at all. They're meant to be going down nice little canals, and if adverse conditions arise, you go to the side of the canal bank or the river bank and you stop. You don't go very far with these. And then the more rounded hulls would have been a little bit better as far as seagoing ship with the Kamacchio hull with the thickened hull plank. I don't have a reconstruction of what the Kamacchio would have looked like, but it's still not a great sailor. It needs to stay close to that coast. So once again, these things are definitely not sailing in adverse conditions. If something comes up, they're going directly to shore to not be in their boat. So this is meant to be for like shallow, very calm waterways. Is the design of these particular ones. So
that makes a lot of sense. And one last question for you. It has to do with that, and you mentioned the mobility of boats. Do you think that there's like less mobility with these boats in particular? And one of your first graphics was the evidence of your tradition versus the Eastern Adriatic tradition, and how there's just a very definitive line between the two. Do you think that that's because of local, very, very local traditions? Yeah, that's kind of like, from an archaeological perspective, I'm like, damn, that's pretty awesome.
Well, and these are two very distinct landscapes too.
Yeah.
So there is, it both supports and doesn't support the environmental deterministic argument at the same time, because all the dots in red, this is those shallow lagoons, inner waterways that can connect all the way from 23 all the way down to 25. Like, you've got these interior channels of water. You don't have to go along the coast. You can follow that man-made canal all the way down. But that eastern half of the Adriatic is rocky, right? That is, and those boats are seafaring boats. I don't know if you can see it, but this boat has a keel. So this Bronze Age Eastern tradition, they're keeled boats. So they're quite distinct. They're using different materials. They've also got really, really tiny holes that are spaced very, very close together. They have this singular loop. That's their pattern of sewing. So they are quite distinct. But they are seagoing ships that are built with this particular lace tradition or sewn tradition.
It's kind of.
I'm not sure if that answered the question. I might have lost track of it.
No, don't worry. It was a weird question, but it's interesting that you don't see the Eastern Adriatic sewn boats on the other side at all.
Okay. So one thing I didn't mention is a plank that was found in Venice, the Venetian lagoon, to shore. It was reused within the walls of a canal there. And I don't include it within my tradition because the holes, we only have the planks. So we don't have any other boats, just a disarticulated plank, but the holes are small, they're spaced really close together. So I no longer have the sewing to confirm what my hypothesis is that it's actually an Eastern Adriatic boat. So I think that I've got some disarticulated remains of an Eastern Adriatic boat incorporated into the canal walls in Venice. One of the indicative things is the fullness of the ship as well as that sewing pattern, and that's not preserved whenever you just have disarticulated planks. So yes, I do have some that suggest that obviously these boats move. So we would expect to find potentially Eastern Adriatic ships that came across the Adriatic and then wrecked there. But so far they are, kind of very clearly aligned. Seafaring boats with the single loop pattern, and then my boats with the other pattern. And that's not even mentioning the stuff that's happening in the continent. That's weird.
Yeah, God, it's weird. That's fantastic. Yeah, very, very interesting. That answered it perfectly. That was great. It's already 9:05, so thank you so much for the time that you've given us and answering all of our questions. We can't really do a round of applause, but I want to thank you again for coming and talking with us. I think we're out of questions too, so this is a perfect time. For anybody who's still here, make sure to come back on April 1st. You'll get emails from me about that lecture with Ann Pyburn. Should be really cool. But yeah, thank you so much. And if anybody wants to type in the Q&A thank yous, that's a good way to do it. We can't do the clap emoji. That's usually how I do it. But
does Zoom not have emojis that you can send?
It does, but I don't think in this particular version. Sometimes you can have reactions, and alas, I can't do that.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun, a nice distraction from the other rest of the normal pandemic teaching.
Absolutely, a little bit of not just pandemic teaching for a little while. So I'm gonna stop recording now, unless you want to do that, Stephanie. I might screw it up. That's very possible.